James 2 verse 10, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law, and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all." In the previous verse, James insisted that to show favoritism to a wealthy person over a poor one is a sin. It is a failure to obey God's command to love others as we love ourselves. We become, by definition, lawbreakers. It is very important for every believer to know that we are not permitted to be selective in our obedience to God. If we fail to obey God fully, then we have disobeyed Him. Partial obedience is not better than full disobedience. A preacher once said, "The life of a Christian is a life of total surrender, total commitment, and total surrender." The Christian life is a life of total commitment and total surrender and total obedience to God. If the life of someone is not one of total surrender and total obedience to God, then it is not a Christian life. Jesus said unto his disciples, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. What shall it profit a person if they shall gain the whole world and lose their own soul?" There are people who choose what instructions to obey in the Word of God, and they claim to have tried in their obedience. God does not accept half obedience from His people. If He is not God in all of your life, then He is not God at all. The whole laws of God are meant to be kept. There is no one we are supposed to default in, and God does not want picky-choosy Christians. James 2 verse 10, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law, and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all." In academic settings, if you have above 70% of a score in a subject, you would be regarded as a brilliant student. However, in a spiritual setting, if you score 99 in your obedience to God's instructions, you have failed woefully and you are guilty. This does not mean absolutely that we will reach perfection in the flesh, but we are not expected to sin willfully or be deliberate about our disobedience to the laws of God. I have heard Christians say, "I don't sleep around. I only sleep with my boyfriend." Fornication is fornication, whether it's with your boyfriend of 20 years or with a random person off the street. You don't negotiate with God. You don't bargain with God and His laws. This is God's universe, and He has set His laws in place. You can't pick and choose which ones you want to follow. You see believers obeying the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," but yet they are comfortable committing adultery. You see, you and I as humans have a tendency to make excuses for our sins. But James 2 verse 10 points the finger at you and me. It tells us we will never meet the mark because we keep 9 commandments out of 10 and default in 1. It is an act of ignorance and naivety about God's grading systems for a person to point accusing fingers on a fornicator when he or she is a liar. There are people who think that the gravity of other people's sins is weightier than theirs, but that is not the case. Although not all sin is the same, every sin has different consequences, and there are varying degrees of consequences for every sin. Let's be clear, all sin is not the same. However, there is nothing like a small sin. You can't say, "Well, I'm better off than that folk because I'm just a gossiper," but he or she is a drunkard. No matter how small a sin may appear, and no matter how high you try to categorize some other sins, sin is sin, and the consequence of sin is death. God demands absolute obedience from us. We must keep all His laws and commands. Jesus said in Matthew 5 verse 19, "Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Jesus was not referring to those who break commandments, but was referring to those who break the least of the commandments of God. Jesus used the word least so that we will never think we are at liberty to overlook the smallest of God's instructions. Sin is sin. A lie is a lie. Our obedience to God must be total if we would receive maximum blessings from Him. A little drop of oil will mess up a white garment and make it unfit for any noble use. In the same vein, refusing to keep a commandment or defaulting in it will make a person become guilty of all. It would then mean that such a person has been wasting his or her time, laboring fruitlessly. Our striving to keep the commandments of God will only attract divine blessing when we are in total obedience to His will. There are some who would wonder why breaking one commandment out of many will render the ones kept worthless. But that is exactly the case. It is not good for children to insult their parents. It is not good for children to steal their parents' money, and it is also bad for children to be lazy in doing house chores. Supposing a child does not insult his parents, and that child is hardworking, but the child steals, will the child be exonerated? Of course not. That is the same rule that plays in our obedience to the instructions of God. James 2 verses 11 and 12 tell us why we become guilty of the whole law by defaulting in one of them. It says, "For he that said, 'Do not commit adultery,' said also, 'Do not kill.' Now if thou commit no adultery, yet if thou kill, thou art become a transgressor of the law. So speak ye and do so as they that shall be judged by the law of liberty." Now James drives the point home. Adultery, murder. We might think of one as profoundly worse than the other. James says that's irrelevant when it comes to our salvation. Break either one of these commandments, and you are a lawbreaker. "But I didn't commit that other sin" is not a valid defense for the sins we do commit. Our righteousness will not get us into heaven. Our God works will not get us into heaven. We must put on the righteousness of Christ. However, although we have put on the righteousness of Christ, we must not take liberties with sin. In my experience, some people have perceived the righteousness of Christ as a free pass to live a life of sin, and that is not right. God has called us to a holy life.
Revelation chapter 22 verse 19, KJV. "And if any man shall take away from the words of the book this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life, and out of the holy city, and from the things which are written in this book. Just as he set out all of the laws to guide us, he has set them for our sake. They are there to make us go the right way." God did not set these laws for his sake. There is no way it will affect God if these laws are not followed. There is no way it will make God stop being God if these laws are not followed. If God says don't steal, it is for our sake. It is to bring peace to the world. If God says don't commit adultery, if you commit it and you destroy yourself, it will not affect God. God will still be God. It will be you facing the consequences physically and spiritually. Proverbs chapter 6 verse 32. "But a man who commits adultery has no sense. Whosoever does so destroys himself." All of these laws are for you to follow, and don't think if you defy them you can bail yourself out through negotiations. The ways of God are not the same as ours, and we need to stop thinking God thinks like us. Isaiah chapter 55 verse 8 through 9, KJV. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." The Bible already told us about this in Proverbs chapter 14 verse 12. "There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof is the ways of death." Don't follow the ways of death. Follow the laws of God and do what is right. The truth is, many people know what is right, but they just want their emotions to drive them so they can feel like they are doing the right thing. You are sinning if you are like this. I did not say this. The Bible mentioned it. James chapter 4 verse 17. "Therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin." I knew I needed to forgive the people who wronged me, but I didn't. I was sinning. You need to consider God first in everything you do. Jesus came to earth and he performed a miracle. He was God in human form. He has every right to change the law. He could say we should not follow the laws of God, that he has a new set of laws, but he didn't. He said he did not come to change anything. Why? The reason is that these laws are not the standard. They can never change as long as God did not change. Matthew chapter 5 verse 17. "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Jesus did not destroy these laws, and if you think you can negotiate these laws, you are making a huge mistake. The right thing for you to do is to ask for forgiveness from God if you have done wrong. Go to God. God is not wicked. He is a loving Father, and he will always forgive all wrongdoings. Stop making it seem like God will not listen to your prayers of forgiveness. Stop making it feel like God doesn't care about you, that he will throw you in hell. You can just ask for forgiveness. That is what God is demanding from you. He knows you have done something bad. He knows you have gone far from him. He will not stop you from asking for forgiveness. He will forgive you, but the standards remain. He will have mercy on you, but the fact that you are forgiven doesn't mean the standards have changed. It doesn't mean God reduced the standard for you. I want you to know that asking for forgiveness of sin is not an act of negotiating. It is an act telling God that you know the punishment and you are trying to ask him to have mercy on you. The approach of negotiating and asking for forgiveness is different. 2 Chronicles chapter 17 verse 14 KJV. "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. That is the right thing to do. That is what is expected of you to do. Just ask for forgiveness and stop making excuses. Jesus said he is the way to the Father. This means if you want to ask for forgiveness, you can only go through Jesus. And that means you need to accept Jesus in your life. Jesus is the way and there is no other way. You need to know this, and through him, you will have full access to the throne of mercy.